Okay, guys, we are on day 2 of Unit 2, so this is Lesson 2, and we're going to talk about conditional statements. A conditional is an if-then statement. So, for example, if I study, I will pass the test. If-then statements are written in, so it should be then I will pass the test. If-then statements are written exactly in that order. If-then. They start with a hypothesis and end with a conclusion. The hypothesis is what we call the p-value of the statement, and it is always linked to the word if, and we underline that one time. The conclusion is what we call the q-value of the statement, and it's usually paired with the word then, and we underline that twice. So in a diagram, we identify a P to a Q. So if P, then Q. Okay? So what I want you to do is I want you to take a minute or 30 seconds, and I want you to underline the hypothesis and the conclusion of these two statements. Underline the hypothesis once and the conclusion twice. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can underline the hypothesis and the conclusion of these two statements. Okay, so hopefully you were able to do that. If an animal is a robin, that's our hypothesis. Then the animal is a bird. That's our conclusion. If it snows, that's our hypothesis. Then we get out of school. That's our conclusion. So I want you to be understood that it doesn't necessarily have to go in the order of P to Q all the time. You can flip it if it's important enough to do that, if the sentence makes sense to do that. Not only do you have to be able to identify, but you have to be able to write a statement as a conditional. So, for example, if angles are vertical, then they share a vertex. And sometimes, obviously this is very simple. You're writing simple sentences. You don't have to, take over the world with these sentences. So go ahead and attempt to write a sentence for this one. Dolphins are mammals. Okay, so hopefully you're able to come up with a sentence similar to this. If an animal is a dolphin, then it is a mammal. Okay, again, I have that key of if and then, and I've got my hypothesis and my conclusion. All right. Sometimes you're asked to look at a hypothesis and conclusion and decide, is it true? If it's not true, then you have to find a counterexample that proves it not to be true. So if a person is British, then they are European. Is every person from England also from Europe? Yes, that is true. So we don't have to find a counterexample to this. If a number is divisible by 3, then it is odd. Is that always true? No. Hopefully you've thought of a number. 6, 12, 18, so forth and so on. Okay? So sometimes you have to look at conditionals, say if they're true or false, and then give an example that proves they're false. A negation is the not of the statement, so it's the opposite. And our symbol for negation is a lot like the congruency symbol. It just doesn't have the equal sign. Okay? And so what I want to talk about today, and this is the most important part of what we're going to be doing today, all right, is that our conditional has 3 steps you can follow after you've gotten down the conditional statement. So let's go back to our original statement. If I study, then I pass. We'll just keep it real simple. If I study, then I pass. This is our P to Q statement. It's written in if and then, and it has a hypothesis and a conclusion. Okay? The first thing that we have to understand is that a conditional can also have a converse. And a converse is when we flip it. So we're going to write the Q and then the P. So for this example, it's if I pass, then I studied. Pretty simple. We just flipped it. The inverse of a statement is the not. So we're talking about not P and not Q. This should be pretty simple. If I don't study, then I don't pass. Pretty simple. So you can see so far we've had an original statement, we flipped the original statement, and then we added the nots to the original statement. And then the contrapositive is when we do both, the flip and the not. So it's not Q to not P. So we're going to take this and flip that. So if I don't pass, I didn't study. Oh man, I just realized I didn't do. No, we did it. Everything's right. If I don't pass, I didn't study. Now, all of these things are true. But what we have to understand is that a conditional and its contrapositive are congruent statements. So if I say that this is true, then this is also true. If I say that this is false, then that is also false. They work together. So the first and the last work together, the middle two work together. Because the converse and inverse are also congruent. So what I want you to do is I want you to write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of this statement right here. If the figure is a square, then it is a quadrilateral. I'll get you started by underlining it and labeling it. And remember, the converse is the flip, the inverse is the not, and the contrapositive is both. So rewrite this sentence as its converse, inverse, and contrapositive. Pause the video. When you unpause, I'll have the answers. Okay, so there's the flip. If it is a quad, the figure is a square. The inverse is, if it is not a square, it is not a quad. And the contrapositive, I just flipped the inverse. If it is not a quad, it is not a square. Now, this is not all that they've said to do. What is the truth value? And if it's false, give a counterexample. So, if a figure is a square, it is a quad. That is true. So we're done with that, with the conditional. If it is a quad, the figure is a square. Well, that's false. Because a rectangle is a quadrilateral. That is not a square. So if it is not a square, it is not a quad. That's also false because remember, these two have the same reason, and so these two will have the same reason. And then finally, if it is not a quad, it is not a square. That is true because these two are, the top is true. Now, they all four could have been true. They all four could have been false. The two on the outside could have been false, and the two in the middle could have been true. It doesn't matter. You have to know whether or not it's true or false. And if it's false, you have to give a reason. Okay, your classwork today or tomorrow is going to follow this exactly in the way that we did the notes. You're going to go to page 139, or I'm sorry, 39. I'm jumping ahead of myself by quite a bit. And the page actually says 1 through 5, but what it meant to say was 1 through 15. So we're going to fix that up. But it follows right along. The first 4 problems, you're going to underline. The hypothesis once, the conclusion twice. The next 4 problems, you're going to rewrite the sentences as if then. 9 and 10, you're going to write those problems as if then statements. So if one thing, then the other. 11 and 12, you're going to say, is that true or false? If it's false, give me an example that proves that it's false. Then we get to the back. 13 through 15, you're going to pick one of them and do the same steps that we did with this problem. So you're going to pick one of them and do the same steps we did with the rectangle or with the square and quadrilateral. All 3 steps. And make sure you say whether they're true or false. And if it's false, give a counterexample. Probably the easiest ones are 14 and 15, but you can pick whichever one that you like. Okay? Thanks for watching the video, and if you don't understand something, make sure you ask me or watch the video again to make sure you understand the idea behind converse, inverse, and contrapositive.